Good evening, brave souls. I'm Grim, and tonight I'll be your companion through the shadows. Together, we'll dive into stories that grow darker with every whisper. So, get comfortable if you're ready. The night is only just beginning. Mara waited for the compound lights to dim, signaling that it was safe. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the silent mantra that had driven her for months. You have to get out. She and her children couldn't stay here, trapped by the rules, the isolation, and the fear. Tonight, she'd risked it all. The overseers believed the outside world would corrupt anyone who left, but Mara believed that whatever awaited them outside was better than the darkness within. With one last look around her dimly lit room, Mara shook her two young children awake. Whispering, she said, "Remember, we have to be quiet. We're going on an adventure. Are you ready?" They nodded, eyes wide, more excited than afraid. At 6 and 4, they were too young to understand the risk, but she needed them to trust her. Her heart ached with the weight of their innocence. They slipped out into the night. The compound stretched behind them, darkened buildings looming like silent guards. She shuddered, remembering the whispered stories of families torn apart, of children taken from mothers who dared question the leader. Mara clutched her children's hands tighter. The first mile felt almost hopeful, the chill of the November night invigorating. She navigated by the moonlight, careful to avoid the gravel paths that could crunch underfoot. With each step, she felt the pull of freedom. She could smell it in the air, could feel it in the open space around her. Yet a strange sensation grew alongside her relief, the feeling of being watched. She turned, but the compound lay silent and still. Another hour passed, and her nerves began to fray. They crossed into a patch of forest, moving deeper into shadowed trees. The leaves rustled underfoot, and a faint breeze whispered through the branches. But something felt off, like there was another presence among the trees, watching them. Her daughter tugged at her hand. "Mommy, are we playing hide-and-seek?" she asked, her voice a hushed giggle. Mara forced a smile, hiding her fear. "Yes, sweetheart. We're hiding, so we have to be very quiet." As they walked, she heard it, a snap of a twig in the darkness behind them. She froze, pulling her children close, listening to her own racing heartbeat. She looked over her shoulder. Nothing, just the trees, tall and silent. They pressed on, but the feeling grew stronger, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. Shadows seemed to thicken around them, and Mara couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every step felt slower, heavier, her own fear twisting into something surreal. Then, a voice. "Mara." It was faint, almost swallowed by the night. She spun around, gripping her children's hands tightly, but there was no one there. Only the darkness and the endless stretch of trees. Her youngest, still clutching her hand, looked up and whispered, "Did you hear that, Mommy?" Mara's heart hammered. She managed a soft, "No, honey, let's keep going." They trudged forward, but the air felt thicker, colder. Her children began to shiver, and she wrapped her coat around them as best she could. Another sound, closer this time. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, as though someone was stepping in sync with her, matching her every move. "Stop playing games!" she called out, her voice wavering. Her own words echoed back at her, lost in the night. There was no answer, only silence. Her pulse thundered as she glanced back, half expecting to see a figure emerge from the trees. But it was only shadows, looming, stretching. Suddenly, her son yelped, pointing into the darkness. "There! I saw something, Mom!" Mara's breath hitched as she peered into the night. At first, she saw nothing, only darkness and the distant outline of trees. But then, just barely, she caught a flicker of movement, a shape, tall and cloaked, almost melting into the shadows. Her blood ran cold. "Run!" she whispered, gripping her children's hands. "Don't look back. Just run!" They sprinted through the trees, her legs burning, her breath ragged. She stumbled, but the sight of her children, pushing forward with determination, forced her to keep going. The footsteps behind them grew louder, faster. Whoever or whatever was following them was getting closer. They burst into a clearing, the pale light of the moon casting long shadows. Mara glanced back, desperate for a sign that they were alone. But there, at the edge of the trees, stood the figure, a dark silhouette, still and silent, as if waiting. It wore a long, flowing robe, and though its face was hidden, she could feel its eyes fixed on her, pinning her in place. "Mama," her daughter whispered, her voice trembling. Mara knelt, holding both children close. "It's okay," she whispered, though she didn't believe her own words. "We're safe now. Just keep looking at me." The figure took a step forward, then another, each movement slow, deliberate. It raised an arm, pointing directly at Mara, and a voice drifted through the air, cold and lifeless. "You cannot leave." Mara's heart thundered. Her voice cracked as she spoke, her words barely audible. "We have to go. This place, it's not our home anymore." The figure took another step forward, the shadows thickening around it, wrapping it in a cloak of darkness. A memory flashed in Mara's mind. Her time in the compound, the feeling of being trapped, watched, controlled. But now here, under the open sky, she felt the stirrings of a power she'd long thought she'd lost. With a final surge of courage, she lifted her head. "We're not going back. We're free." The figure paused, as if considering her words. Then slowly, it lowered its arm, the shadows retreating. The cold grip on Mara's heart eased as the figure began to dissolve, melting into the night, leaving nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in its place. The air cleared, and the oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the gentle sounds of the forest. Mara took a shaky breath, clutching her children tightly. They were safe. They were free. Together, they walked toward the edge of the forest, the first hints of dawn breaking through the trees, casting golden light across their path. As they stepped into the open field, leaving the shadows of the compound behind, Mara knew they'd escaped not just a place, but a prison of the soul. And with each step forward, she felt the weight of the past fade, replaced by the strength to face whatever the future held. They were finally free. 15-year-old Lila sat alone on her bed, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the letter. It was the 7th one she'd received, and she knew each word by heart. The letters, smuggled to her from an unknown source, felt like secrets seeping through the cracks of the strict, oppressive walls of the polygamous church community. Each note was signed by Cora, a name Lila had never heard before, yet one that felt hauntingly familiar. "I think we're sisters," the last letter had read, "and I think they kept us apart on purpose." The thought left Lila feeling both thrilled and terrified. In their world, family secrets were kept close, buried deep. To question was dangerous. To look for lost family was forbidden. But a sister, a real sister? Lila had spent so many years feeling alone, yearning for something outside of her cold, controlled world. Now she had a chance to find her. That night, after everyone in the compound was asleep, Lila tiptoed out of her room and made her way to the edge of the fence that bordered their property. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the darkness, hoping Cora would be there as promised. "Lila!" A soft voice broke through the silence. Out of the shadows, a girl her age emerged, thin and pale, with the same wide eyes as Lila's. "Cora," Lila whispered. The girls stared at each other, struck by the same haunting realization. They looked like mirror images, separated only by time and circumstance. They embraced, a connection forming as if no time had passed between them. They quickly sat down behind a cluster of trees to avoid any watchful eyes from the compound. "Why were we separated?" Lila asked, her voice filled with the same questions that had haunted her for weeks. Cora's face tightened. "I overheard our father talking to the elders. They called us the twins. They said twins are a sign of darkness and impurity." Her voice wavered. "I don't know what it means, but they seemed afraid of us, like we were something cursed." Lila's heart sank. "They called twins evil? Why?" Cora shook her head, her face pale. "There's something wrong here, Lila. I think they did something to our mother." Their mother. Neither girl knew much about her, except that she died shortly after they were born. But rumors had always lingered, that she was cursed, that she tempted darkness. Stories the church told them to instill fear, to keep them obedient. Lila felt a surge of anger. She wanted answers. "Come with me," Cora whispered. "There's an old cellar beneath the church. I heard them say that's where they keep records of people like us, people who brought darkness. Maybe it can tell us what happened to Mom." Lila nodded, a chill running down her spine. Together, they snuck through the compound, careful to avoid the patrols. As they approached the church, the weight of their mission pressed down on them. Fear made every sound sharper, every shadow darker. But their shared purpose kept them moving forward. They found the door to the cellar, tucked away behind a row of bushes. It was locked, but Cora pulled out a small, twisted piece of metal and expertly jimmied it open. Lila was impressed. Her sister had learned a thing or two about sneaking around. The air inside the cellar was thick with dust and the musty scent of forgotten things. Shelves lined the walls, each stacked with crumbling books and tattered papers. The girls sifted through the files, fingers trembling as they uncovered record after record. Then Cora pulled out a faded envelope labeled with a name that made Lila's heart skip a beat. Rose Evans. Their mother. They opened the envelope with trembling hands, skimming the faded words that filled the brittle papers. It painted a horrifying picture. Rose had been young when she joined the church, promised a place among the righteous. But after her pregnancy, she'd begun speaking out, calling attention to things no one else dared question. She'd accused the elders of hiding dark secrets, secrets they'd punished her for. Her curse was nothing but their excuse to silence her. Then, Lila's hand froze over a line of text near the bottom. "Twins born under the blood moon shall bring ruin and retribution." The girls looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear and realization. "They were afraid of us," Cora whispered. "They thought we'd uncover the truth, just like our mother tried to." The truth lay heavy in the room, the weight of generations bound by fear and lies. A distant sound, footsteps echoing in the hall above, broke their trance. The girls looked at each other, their terror mirrored in each other's eyes. "We need to leave," Lila whispered urgently. But before they could move, the cellar door slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. Lila's pulse quickened as she heard a voice outside the door, a voice she recognized as their father's. "Thought you could sneak out, didn't you?" His tone was cold, filled with a barely restrained anger. "We've kept you apart for a reason, girls. You were never meant to meet." Cora gripped Lila's hand, her voice a terrified whisper. "What do we do?" Lila's mind raced. She remembered something she'd seen earlier in the files, a mention of an old escape tunnel in the cellar. She frantically searched the walls, feeling for anything that might lead them to freedom. Finally, her fingers brushed against a loose brick. She pushed, and a small section of the wall shifted, revealing a narrow tunnel. She motioned to Cora, who squeezed through, pulling Lila with her just as the door burst open, their father's furious face illuminated by the dim light of a lantern. They scrambled through the tunnel, hearing the distant echoes of footsteps and angry shouts behind them. They didn't stop until they'd emerged from the other side, into the cool night air. Free, but forever changed. Panting, the girls held each other tightly. The compound loomed dark in the distance, a twisted reminder of the life they were leaving behind. But they'd uncovered the truth, pieced together a family shattered by fear and deceit. The realization settled over them. They were stronger together, bound by the legacy their mother had fought and died for. "We're free," Cora whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Lila nodded, but the scars of the night would never leave them. As they walked into the unknown, the memories of their mother's sacrifice and the sinister secrets of their past remained, a haunting reminder of the darkness they'd escaped, but would carry with them always. The memory crept up on Sarah, slipping in like the last chill of night before dawn. She thought she'd escaped, thought the strange shadows of her childhood would fade with time. But here she was, back in town, where the blue dresses and hollow-eyed stares still haunted her dreams. The blue dress funerals began when Sarah was 10. She remembered the first one vividly. A girl named Marcy, barely older than Sarah, had gone to the afterlife, as the elders said. Marcy wore a blue dress, carefully ironed and lace-trimmed, lying so still in her coffin. Sarah couldn't remember Marcy being sick or in trouble or anything at all that would lead to a funeral. She had just vanished. And Marcy wasn't the only one. In the years that followed, more young girls left just as mysteriously, only to reappear as cold bodies in polished caskets. They were all dressed in blue, a solemn sea of innocence veiled in navy and sky. Sarah was too young then to question the empty gazes of the mothers, the downturned heads of the fathers, or the silence of the community. But even then, a sense of wrongness had gripped her, and that feeling had only deepened as she grew. Now, standing outside the gates of the old compound, her stomach twisted. She hadn't been back since she'd left at 16. She'd moved to the city, erased the strange customs from her mind, built a new life. But that nagging memory, the girls, the blue dresses, the haunted faces, had never left. Sarah took a breath and pushed open the gate. The place was quiet, as if it had been frozen in time, left untouched by the years. The air was thick with that same strange silence that used to press down on her chest like a weight. Her footsteps echoed as she walked past the abandoned church, its wooden walls peeling, windows clouded with dust. She found herself drifting toward the old graveyard. In the distance, she saw a row of tiny, weather-beaten tombstones. These were the graves of the blue dress girls, as she'd begun to call them. She crouched by one, brushing away the leaves to reveal Marcy's name etched in fading letters. A strange chill passed over her, and a thought struck her. What if they didn't leave at all? What if there was a reason why so many girls had vanished, only to be buried here, their stories swallowed by silence? The wind shifted, carrying the sound of footsteps behind her. Sarah turned, her heart racing, but there was no one. The cemetery was empty, the air thick and heavy. But she could feel something. eyes watching her, lingering like shadows from the past. And then she saw them. A faint shape flickered near the far corner of the graveyard, just on the edge of her vision. A girl in a blue dress, her face pale, her eyes hollow and searching. She was young, with loose dark hair that swayed in the breeze. Sarah's heart stopped. It was Marcy. "Marcy," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But Marcy didn't respond. She simply stared, her eyes dark with a sorrow that seemed endless. And then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. Sarah staggered back, her heart pounding. Had she imagined it? But as she looked around, more figures began to materialize, each dressed in blue. Some were familiar faces from her childhood, girls she remembered playing with, laughing with, girls who had vanished and reappeared in coffins. They stood in silence, their expressions blank, yet tinged with an anguish that sent chills down Sarah's spine. She could almost hear them, as if they were calling out in voices too soft for the living to hear. A feeling of dread gripped her. She had to know the truth, had to understand what had happened to these girls. She turned and ran to the church, pushing open the heavy doors and stepping inside. Dust swirled in the dim light, coating the old pews and altar. Behind the altar, hidden away in a corner, was a small door she'd never noticed before. She pushed it open, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness. She hesitated, but something compelled her forward, a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. The stairs led down to a cramped, windowless room. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old books and ledgers. She picked one up, blowing off a thick layer of dust. The pages were filled with lists of names, dates, records of births and deaths. Her fingers skimmed the page, landing on Marcy's name. Next to it, in neat, precise handwriting, were the words, "Sent to eternal rest." A chill crawled up her spine as she flipped through more pages, recognizing name after name. All the girls who had vanished were listed here, marked with that same ominous phrase. A sense of horror dawned on her as she pieced together the truth. These girls hadn't just gone to the afterlife. They had been taken, silenced. Why? The reason lay just out of reach, but the weight of the secret bore down on her, suffocating and dark. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the stairs, a familiar, cold voice that made her blood run cold. Looking for something? She turned to see Elder Brooks, the stern-faced man who had presided over every blue dress funeral. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, and his mouth twisted into a knowing smile. "What happened to them?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Why did you—" Elder Brooks shook his head, his gaze filled with a twisted pity. "You never should have come back, Sarah. You were always too curious for your own good." Her stomach twisted as she took a step back, her gaze darting to the small window above. But there was no escape. "They were marked," he continued, his voice cold and unfeeling. "Marked for their sins. They brought darkness upon us, and they paid the price." Sarah felt a wave of nausea. They were just children. He shrugged, his face hardening. It was a necessary sacrifice. A whispering sound filled the air, growing louder and louder until it seemed to echo off the walls. The spirits of the girls were here, their voices rising, swirling around them like a storm, their eyes fixed on Elder Brooks, cold and unforgiving. He stepped back, his face paling as he heard the voices. No, this wasn't supposed to happen." The lights flickered, and Sarah watched as the spirits surrounded him, their forms growing clearer, their eyes filled with the rage of lives stolen too soon. Elder Brooks' screams echoed through the room, but no one would hear him. Not here. As the light returned to normal, the spirits faded, leaving only silence behind. Sarah felt a strange peace settle over her, a calm that wrapped around her like a gentle breeze. She left the compound, never looking back, the faces of the blue dress girls forever etched in her memory. And as she walked away, she could almost feel their presence beside her, finally free, finally at rest. And as the darkness fades, remember, the real chills linger long after the story's end. Until next time, brave souls.